I'm just wondering right off the bat, does anybody else ever have that dream where you're doing a presentation and then you realize you're at the wrong conference? Does it sort of feel like that? I didn't make the conference last year, I had a conflict, but 2 years ago I was here and I was also speaking on sort of an LTE related topic. So I seem to be that guy who always shows up at Wi-Fi conferences talking about LTE stuff, but that's fine. What I'm going to be talking about today is really a new opportunity that I'd like to make you aware of around LTE services that are really much more like Wi-Fi and truly a WLAN service. So this is shared spectrum LTE. I want to distinguish right off the bat that I'm not talking about LTE in 5 gigahertz. So as I mentioned 2 years ago, I talked about LTE-U and LAA and LWA and some of the concerns and whatnot that we had as an industry around those. What I'm going to be talking about today is really around a new opportunity in 3.5 gigahertz in the CBRS band, and we're going to go into some detail on that. But I thought it was worth, I know Keith said don't waste a lot of time up front setting the stage, but I think because this is a little bit of a different topic, we need to do that. I think this is all part of what's going on with convergence, and I don't like using hypey words too much, but we truly do live in a time where the Wi-Fi world and the cellular world, at least from a historical perspective, are coming together. And I thought that was a great session we had yesterday on 11AX, and I would characterize a lot of the features that we're going to see in AX in terms of OFDMA and power efficiencies and spectral efficiencies is all sort of falling under an umbrella of greater coordination and synchronization in time, in space, and in frequency. And really those are things that the cellular industry has been doing for a long time. So I think in that way we're seeing Wi-Fi embracing some cellular capabilities. At the same time, if you look at the mobile industry, and I'll be in Barcelona next week for Mobile World Congress, and all the talk there is going to be about 5G, right? And if you look at 5G, it's largely about small cells, densification, indoor coverage, and then what we're going to be talking about here is also adding in multi-operator capability. So over a single radio, the opportunity or the ability to support subscribers of different mobile operators and potentially enterprises as well. So you can see all of those things are Wi-Fi's historical heritage. And we got the cellular industry moving in that direction. So, things are coming together. That's not a bad thing. I mean, there's some things to be concerned about. There's some things to be excited about. This is one of the things to be excited about, in my opinion. So, hope that you'll share my excitement when I'm done. So my day job, I do regulatory and standards at Ruckus. I saw the tweet the other day from Ian, and he had sort of the vendor hype marketing org chart. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but I saw it. And I thought as a vendor rep, I probably ought to own one of those titles. So I'm going to go with Director of Shiny New Things. So I'm always talking about stuff that's sort of coming down the pipe. Okay, so goals for the session. Provide an overview of shared spectrum LTE. What is it? Talk about 2 organizations that are really bringing this to the market. So Wind Forum and the CBS Alliance. Talk about some of the things that are going to happen in terms of modifications to LTE in order to make it work more like a WLAN service. And then outline the opportunity for you. Why does this pertain to all of you in this room? And then because I've only got 30 minutes, we'll conclude with some pointers to additional resources and learning. Okay, so I mentioned before, the presentation really hinges around what's called CBRS, which is the Citizens Broadband Radio Service. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have been tracking at a reasonable level what's been going on with 3.5, 3.5? Okay, so not a lot, which is fine. I wouldn't expect necessarily that you would, but so I hope this will be informative to those of you who haven't been. So what is CBRS? I'm going to start off with what CBRS is not. This is my humor slide, so you're encouraged to laugh. So this was an article that came out in England, August timeframe, And somebody just got confused. So it's Citizens Broadband Radio Service, not Citizens Band Radio Service. So no, we are indeed not going to be having fights with truckers about this, and we're going to be operating at 3.5. Does anybody, as a wireless trivia question, anybody know where the CB band operates? 27 megahertz. You should get a door prize. I'll put a plug in for you. Anybody know how wide, so at 27 megahertz, that's really nice low frequency spectrum, obviously. Anybody know how wide a CB channel is? 10 kilohertz, wow, very good. So not a lot of capacity, obviously, in CB band. So this guy didn't quite get it right in terms of what this is. What it, in fact, is a new spectrum framework from the FCC about how to make better use of the spectrum that we already have, some of which has been allocated. And fundamentally, this slide, I just want you to focus on the fact that it involves spectrum sharing. So we have incumbents operating here, those 3 red bars at the top, and we'll go into some detail on who they are and what they're doing. What we're going to do is we're going to allow new commercial shared use of that band. So we all understand shared use in 5 gigahertz with, Uni 2 extended. Kind of similar concept, but these things move, they're intermittent, so there's both a sensing capability, there's also some issues around aggregate interference. So we're going to introduce a central coordination function with CBRS, which is certainly going to be distinguishing it from what we all know with DFS. But the thing I want to mention here is just that shared use is going to become more and more important going forward. There really isn't much spectrum available sub 10 gigahertz that's not already allocated. And you can't just, clear people out of where they've been operating for a while, where their vendors have been developing equipment for a while, and say, hey, we're going to make this now available for LTE services or Wi-Fi services or whatever. So sharing is going to become more and more a part of the regulator's toolbox, and you're going to see more and more management frameworks that embrace sharing. So just want to make that point up front. Another point on this slide, this range of 3550 to 3700, so obviously 150 megahertz, it happens to overlap directly with 2 3GPP bands. So 3GPP cellular industry standards. They have a band 42, which is 3400 to 3600, and a band 43 from 36 to 3800. Those are defined pretty much globally as TDD, or time division, LTE bands around the world, so that's an important thing to note as we start talking about what kind of services could make use of the spectrum. A little bit of backstory. Where this all probably started, mostly in the US anyhow, is with this report. So the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology produced a report in 2012. This is for, obviously, President Obama. And it was basically making the point that I said earlier, that there really isn't a lot of good low and mid-band spectrum that's available. So we're going to have to make better use of what we already have. And they were looking specifically at sharing spectrum that had been allocated to government users or federal users. And so the President read the report, and there's a lot of people who participated in this, economists and technologists. The President read the report, turned around and issued an order to FCC and NTIA, and basically told them, hey, this makes sense. We need to start doing some work around sharing government spectrum. And I would say that has direct, you can trace CBRS directly back to this PCAST report. A few notable participants here. There was 35 or 40 people, Eric Schmidt and all sorts of other folks were involved in this work. But some of the people that I just will call out specifically, obviously Tom Wheeler, you might know him. A gentleman named Yochai Benkler. He's actually a professor at Harvard doing economics. And he's done what I consider just some amazing, really seminal work on how do you value open spectrum as in contrast to traditionally licensed spectrum. I actually included a link to his one of his papers here. If you haven't read it, I would really highly encourage it. It's about 10 or 12 pages. It doesn't take long, but it's quite good. Last point I'll make here is that, so this was July of 2012 in the US. There's a similar development in the UK recently. There's a group over there called the National Infrastructure Commission, NIC. They produced a report that came out just before Christmas, December 20th, I think, around there. And they were making a report to the UK government and to Ofcom, which is the UK regulator. And they made a lot of the same points that were made in this PCAST report in terms of the inefficiencies around just allocating spectrum, via spectrum auction and doing it fully licensed at a regional or a national level, and how that doesn't address issues for rural coverage where mobile operators don't have economic incentive to build out. It doesn't address in-building coverage. And this UK report was also encouraging the government to look at encouraging alternate providers in addition to the traditional mobile players. So I think that's encouraging. This PCAST report was a few years ago and has led to CBRS. I think we can be hopeful that some of the activity in Europe will lead to similar frameworks in Europe going forward. Looking at time, they do have a two-tier framework in Europe called LSA. But right now, that doesn't really open it up for sort of wireless LAN type deployments like CBRS does. I'll circle back to that. So, three-tier spectrum sharing. What are we talking about? Well, the tiers, you've got the incumbents. So I already said that we had people utilizing this band before. You've got, at the incumbent level, you've got some DoD users, and that's actually Navy radar systems that are used for aircraft navigation is what they're used for. So as you can imagine, that use tends to be concentrated along the coasts, tends to really be concentrated around a few of the specific big ports where the aircraft carriers and the amphibious ships operate. There are a few Navy bases, I guess you'd call them, inland where they operate, but that's like 2 in the country, so not very many. So we have those Navy users. The incumbents are all protected. The Navy is going to be protected by an array of sensors that are being deployed upon the, along the coast. And when one of these Navy radars comes in range, the sensor will pick up on the signature, and it will essentially move any of the shared users out of the way of the Navy. And we'll talk about how that happens.
I just have a question. You're like saying DFS on a statewide scale?
On a, sorry, what?
Like on a huge geography scale? Instead of
distributed DFS along the coast, correct, waiting for the Navy to show up. Mm-hmm. But with a central coordination function, so I'll get to that, which is a little different. So, other incumbents, we have the satellite operations here. So this is actually part of the C-band downlink. So the space-to-Earth portion of the C-band operates partially in the spectrum. And then you also have some WISPs. So historically, this is spectrum that has been used by WiMAX and other proprietary airlinks. And so a number of WISPs do use this mostly for rural coverage. And an important point to note about the WISP usage is that they will actually be transitioned over to the Part 96 or the CBRS rules of operation over about a 4-year period. So the Navy and the satellite use, they get protections sort of in perpetuity. The WISPs get protections during this grandfather period, but then they're expected to incorporate into the overall CBRS framework over the next 4 years or so. So that's the incumbents. The next tier is what's called priority access licenses. So this is a short-term license at a very granular geographic level. So the way we've typically auctioned spectrum off at the licensed, in sort of the licensed regime would be, at a regional, metropolitan, national level. We're going to give you a license for X billions of dollars, and you're going to have that for 10 years, 20 years, whatever the auction term is or the license term is. PAL is very different. PAL is, we're dividing these things up based on the census tract. So there's 74,000 census tracts across the US. That's how big a PAL license will cover, is the census tract. They are only available in the lower 100 megahertz, so from 3550 to 3650. only 70 megahertz of that can be allocated for PAL. So they'll be located in that lower 100, but only 70 of that can be allocated to PAL in the first place. There's some other characteristics. It's a 10 megahertz channel. It's, in terms of how they're going to structure the auctions, there's some requirements here. Essentially, the commission really wanted to encourage competition here and also make sure that no one entity really sort of dominated the PAL structure or the PAL licenses. So only 40 megahertz can be held by any single entity. There has to be at least 2 bidders in each census tract for the PALs in order for them to be licensed at all. And I think those were the points I wanted to make on the auction. The other thing that's really important to understand is if you were to go out and purchase one of these PALs when they have the auction, you won't get a specific frequency assignment. So you can't go to the PAL and say, you know, for this census tract in Phoenix, I want 3560 to 3570. That's not the way it works. You basically say, for this census tract in Phoenix, I need 10 megahertz or I need 20 megahertz, and you bid on that. And auction rules haven't been written yet. That's still to be determined by the FCC. But it's likely that, you know, you'll be assigned perhaps a primary channel and then a backup channel. And again, because we've got this right of preemption by the incumbents, especially by the Navy, it could be that today you're operating in one frequency range and tomorrow you get preempted and you're operating in a different frequency range. And it's sort of this dynamic aspect to CBRS which makes it very unique, especially when you consider having a right to access spectrum, which is really what the PAL is. Okay, enough about PAL. GAA, which is probably the one that we care about the most in this room. GAA at Tier 3 is General Authorized Access. And essentially it's pretty simple. It's what it says here. It's opportunistic or permissive use of the band where and when it's not being utilized. So if there's not an incumbent and there's not a PAL, it's open to use. I have seen people say, you know, call Tier 3 or GA unlicensed, and that's not technically accurate. There is still a coordination requirement. To use GAA, you actually have to acknowledge, you know, the lack of interference protections and the potential to be preempted. So there's some things that you actually have to agree to, even for GAA operations. So it's not unlicensed, but it is opportunistic and permissive. And again, considering the characteristics of the incumbents, obviously the satellite and the WISP users are pretty much where they are and they're not going anywhere. The Navy DoD systems are really narrow band. We're talking a couple megahertz here. So they're only going to very likely interfere with a single channel at a time, single one of these 10 megahertz channels at a time. So that makes a lot of spectrum available at GAA. And if you're in building, and you look at the propagation characteristics of 3.5, we think that as a property owner, you'll almost have an inherent right to 150 megahertz of spectrum at the GAA tier. Now, that's assuming that you control that space. It's not like a multi-tenant office building or residential complex. That may get a little bit more complicated. But you know, if one entity controls a space, then that potentially is 150 megahertz of LTE spectrum to work with at the GAA tier. So Jessica Rosenworcel, one of the commissioners until recently, had this statement, you know, with CBRS, we're really blurring the lines between licensed and unlicensed. Again, GA is not unlicensed, so, but the spirit of what she was saying is absolutely true. Let's get away from we have to statically allocate spectrum for licensed or we have to statically allocate it for unlicensed or opportunistic use. Let's create a framework that can be adaptive and see where the market goes, and that's really what they were trying to do here. Okay. So, CBRS conceptual framework, how does this all work? That's great, you've got these tiers and preemption and protection, but you know, tell me how it works. The critical thing here is the introduction of a spectrum access system, or SAS. This is a cloud-based geolocation database that manages access to the band. And provides protection to the incumbents and provides the preemptions based on the tier that you're operating at, as we talked about. So there are going to be a number of companies providing these SaaS services. Right now, there's 7 different companies that are working with the FCC to become certified as SAS administrators. Down at the bottom, you have your radio nodes. Those are referred to as CBSDs, CBRS devices, essentially. There'll be communication. So this is sort of the CBRS management plane, if you will. It doesn't indicate the network management plane or network control or data. I mean, all of that is sort of from the radios to whatever RAN vendor you're using. But just from a CBRS management perspective, you're going to have this communication for, again, CBRS management plane. So protocol interfaces being developed between the SASs and the CBSDs, between the SASs and each other. And then at the top, you have these 2 purple blocks. So on the right, we've got that incumbent detection. So that's the ESC, which detects the Navy radars. And can't go into a lot of detail, but there's a sort of obfuscation layer involved in that. Obviously, the Navy wants to make sure that none of that information can be used nefariously. So there's an OPSEC requirement around how that data is utilized. And then on the left, at the top of the slide, we have the FCC databases. So for the commercial incumbents, they have entries in ULS and other databases. And so the SAS will have interfaces there to know, again, where those stations are operating, what their characteristics are. And it will use all of that to model the environment so that when it receives a request from a CBRS device, a CBSD, it'll know what is available at the GAA tier or the PAL tier at that location. A few things on CBSDs. There's 2 classes, Class A and Class B. It's a generalization to be sure, but Class A can be thought of as sort of small cell indoor based on power levels and some of the installation requirements. Class B is more of an outdoor picocell type of a deployment. There's a location requirement around the CBSDs in order for the SASs to do the modeling that they need to do to manage the environment. They need to know where these guys are, as well as what powers they're operating at and whatnot. So CBSDs have to report their location to the SASs when they register, and that's a plus minus 50 meters horizontal and plus minus 3 meters vertical accuracy requirement for the CBSDs. If you look through the Commission's proceeding, which is actually 12354, if you want to go look on the FCC website, you'll see when the Commission issued the final rules and order, they made it pretty clear that they expect industry to come up with some solutions where CBSDs will be able to determine their location and report that automatically, and that's supported at the Category A CBSD level. Lacking that, there's a professional installer capability, so there's going to be a whole program to manage certified professional installers who can go out and deploy these and record the location into the databases that the SASs will use. Category B CBSDs, because they're higher power, because they're outdoor, they will require professional installation always. Category A not, if they can determine location themselves. In Category B, because they're outdoor, they'll only be authorized after the ESC, the sensing network, is in place. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit. 2 organizations that are really commercializing this. The first is called Wireless Innovation Forum. Everybody calls it WIN Forum, and specifically the Spectrum Sharing Committee. This is the group that's really fleshing out the FCC's framework. 5 different working groups. I won't go through the details. You can read the slide. It's important to note that this organization is air interface independent. So the FCC obviously doesn't lay out what technologies will be used in a band. They just set the operating parameters for the band. So the FCC, when they created this, I would say they were open to cellular air links, unlicensed or Wi-Fi-like air links, WiMAX, and anything else that might come along. So the work that WIN Forum is doing needs to be Airlink independent, and it is. So they're really coming up again with the requirements and protocol specs and operational, programs that are needed just to make CBRS work, to make that communication between the SASs and the CBSDs and the SASs and the ESCs and all the other components happen. That is what WIN Forum is doing. It's got 82 members. So it's a large organization now. It's very representative of mobile and cable and a bunch of other industries. And this last point is important because they're communicating regularly with the FCC. On the timeline, the FCC published the final rules and orders for CBRS in May of 2016. They also initiated a proceeding to approve SAS and ESC administrators in May of 2016. December of 16, they conditionally approved all 7 of the companies that had applied to become SAS administrators. That process is continuing. And now we're getting really close to the, what we believe will be the approval of some SAS administrators for GAA operation in the band. We think PAL will follow because of the complexity around the auction of those 74,000 tracks and the 7 licenses per track. That's 500,000 licenses that they've got to deal with in an auction. So we think GAA will be authorized later this year. PAL will follow sometime after that. WG4, the test and certification group here, is working very closely with the FCC. I would say, the FCC is obviously independent, but WG4 is developing test harnesses, test scripts, and communicating regularly with the Commission about how they plan to certify not only the SASs, but also the CBSDs. Obviously, there'll be a Part 96 certification from the FCC. You have to show that, when the Navy shows up, you vacate the channel and all those sorts of things. That'll be part of the certification. Okay. CBRS Alliance is the other org I wanted to touch on. So this is a younger organization than Wind Forum. This was founded or launched publicly in August of 16, so 6 months ago. We had 6 members when we launched. We have 37 members as of yesterday. I should caveat that I'm actually an officer of the Alliance, so for whatever that's worth. Lots of different industries represented here. Again, mobile cable, cellular infrastructure vendors, Wi-Fi vendors. You've got Ruckus here, obviously Cisco's a member as well. Neutral host providers, so the American Towers, Extonets, Crown Castles of the world are on board. And unlike Wind Forum, which is air interface agnostic, if you will, CBRS Alliance is very much about LTE solutions for CBRS. So it's about promoting those, filling in technical gaps, and then developing a certification, which could be akin to the Wi-Fi Alliance's certification, to ensure some multi-vendor interoperability here. Okay, so what kind of modifications do we need to do to LTE to make it more like a WLAN service? Well, LTE has always assumed that it's operating, a radio is operating for a operator on a band. And now we're kind of breaking that model. With CBRS, especially at the GA tier, the idea would be that an enterprise or a public venue could deploy radios and support the subscribers from all of the MNOs, and potentially also their own employees or users via private LTE services. So in order to do that, we've got to extend LTE. And the Multi-Fire Alliance, which is doing LTE, standalone LTE in 5 gigahertz, they began working on this a few years ago now. And CBRS Alliance has got a parallel activity around this. I'm running low on time, but I'll just point out that this is leveraging a lot of the same things that Brian was just talking about in terms of .1x and EAP. So these are EAP mechanisms, if you will. So all of the federated authentication and authorization and accounting that is starting to emerge to support Eduroam and Hotspot 2.0 and all of that essentially can be reutilized here. So this was a demo that we did last year. This was a year ago in Barcelona at MWC. And we showed how a single LTE small cell could support an SKT subscriber and a Sprint subscriber. And SKT was essentially the local operator, and then we would forward the Sprint authentication request back to Sprint via AAA system and Radius and domain forwarding. So very much something that we're familiar with. Other thing that needs to happen is some work around co-channel coexistence. Again, because LTE is historically operated on a discrete band for an operator, you haven't had to worry about conflicting operations from different operators. With the GAA tier especially, we now have the opportunity to have multiple operators sharing the channel potentially. So WinForum is doing some foundational work. You can read about it. I would say that this is about, sort of putting the structure in place. Again, they have to be technology independent, so they're coming up with a framework which would, encompass any technology that might work there. And then CBRS Alliance is extending that and looking specifically at LTE optimizations. That could be for GA co-channel operation. It could also be for PALs that are operating on the same channel in adjacent census tracts, and where that edge boundary is, there should be some optimizations and coordination. So CBRS Alliance is looking at those. And when you put the pieces together, this is sort of what the vision that I want to leave you with is a venue being able to deploy LTE small cells, much like they deploy Wi-Fi access points today, on shared spectrum, supporting subscribers of different mobile operators, but also supporting private LTE services. And as you start to see demonstrations of CBRS solutions, you'll notice that people are highlighting this private LTE capability. There'll be a lot of talk about this next week at Mobile World Congress. Qualcomm actually announced a new modem, new LTE modem on Monday, the X20. And one of the things they specifically called out about the X20 is it supports the CBRS band. And they noted the private LTE capability. So credential-wise, certainly SIM, back to an HSS, but also potentially non-SIM credentials. So some of the things that we've done with TLS and client certificates are certainly being entertained here. And the opportunity to deploy this not as an alternative to Wi-Fi, but as a complement to Wi-Fi. So if I were to come in here and say, I've got 150 megahertz of additional spectrum you can use for enterprise services, data, and voice, you'd probably be excited. This is just going to be using an LTE Airlink instead of a Wi-Fi Airlink. Additional resources, I'll just leave these for you. But I would highlight there's a webinar tomorrow that the WinForum is putting on. I know you'll all be here, but if you register for the webinar, you'll at least get the link to the recording when it gets posted. So that's going to cover all of those protocol interfaces between SASs and CBSDs, a few other resources, and I'm out of time. Thank you.
Great, thank you.